We're gonna keep on keeping on. We're gonna work into topics 5.7, 5.8, and 5.16, which are meat production methods, impacts of overfishing, and aquaculture. Keeping our eye on these enduring understandings that when humans use natural resources, they alter natural systems, but we can mitigate that impact through sustainable practices. All right. So quick review, going way back to Unit 1, I believe, this 10% rule and how that applies to a high meat diet versus a high plant-based diet. All right, we have to remember this 10% rule that we lose 90% of the calories available with each step up that food chain or up to trophic levels. All right. So because of that, relying on a high meat diet, which at a minimum is at this primary consumer level, it's a much less efficient system. Okay. So again, by consuming a heavy meat diet, which is going to be at a minimum that primary consumer level, we're losing a lot of efficiency in terms of the number of calories available. So therefore, more land use, right? More habitat destruction, etc., with a high meat diet. Okay, so that being said, let's delve into understanding that not all meat production is the same, right? So we have these CAFO style or concentrated animal feeding operations, a sort of factory style farming of animals where you take a lot of animals, put them in a very confined space, feed them, water them all within that one location. All right. And that system is very different from this pasture system or what they call a free range system, right? Now, both systems have advantages and disadvantages associated with them, and we'll talk about those, but we have to understand that uh, a kilogram of beef from a CAFO system, right, has very different inputs and different ecological implications than a kilogram of beef raised on open pasture eating native grasses. All right. So it's also worth understanding that different types of meat have different impacts. So you guys will notice from this graphic right here that beef and lamb, for example, have very high carbon footprints associated with them. But if we look down at like poultry and pork, other common meat sources for us in this part of the world, right, have far smaller carbon footprints associated with them in terms of greenhouse gases and their uh, associated with the land use change, the feed, the transport, and everything. Okay, so not only are not all meat production systems the same in terms of their impact, but different types of animals have different impacts per kilogram, right? And you'll notice that some vegetarian foods are actually higher on their greenhouse gas impact per kilogram than meats, although it is worth pointing out that this is per kilogram. So to consume a kilogram of chocolate or a kilogram of coffee, right, it's a lot more servings than a kilogram of beef or chicken or poultry. Like that. It's a lot of coffee or a lot of chocolate to have in one sitting. All right. That being said, let's move on. Let's talk about CAFOs, concentrated animal feeding operation. That's what that CAFO stands for. Right. Again, there are advantages, including some that might be considered ecological advantages. But let's begin. First of all, it's cheaper. So the fact that we can go and get cheap beef and cheap chicken and cheap pork at the grocery store, a lot of that is because it's raised in this system, which does reduce the cost, right? Because we're keeping these animals in relatively small area, we can actually reduce the amount of land area required to raise those animals. All right, we get more food from this system because it's highly mechanized. All right, and in the case of improper grazing techniques, we actually get less overgrazing, desertification, etc., because we're confining these animals to a much smaller area. All right. Now, disadvantage. Of course, this is less humane. This is not a fun way to live for these animals. All right. Does require large inputs of grain. So even though these animals aren't out grazing, they still need their food, and that food has to be produced somewhere. And often they are fed grain. So basically, corn, for example, is grown, on cropland, and we take that corn and feed it to the cattle at a CAFO. So there still is land use involved with the production of that beef. All right. Now, because we're putting a ton of animals in a small space, there's a much higher probability of disease and infections and rapid spread of that disease and infections. All right. And there's also higher greenhouse gas emissions associated with this. And part of that has to do with the diet that they're fed, particularly with our beef, which has the highest uh, greenhouse gas footprint anyways. Um, so the amount of methane, which is a really potent greenhouse gas that cattle produce, is partially dependent on the type of food they're given. All right. And so the high grain diet, particularly corn fed to cattle in these CAFO style operations, which does fatten them up nicely, does cause an increase in the amount of methane they produce. All right. And well, again, this is sort of a special case that we'll talk about later, but this is where a lot of antibiotic resistant bacteria is kind of a breeding ground for it. Okay. Um, oh yeah, and also if you consider, all animals produce waste, right? And so we're putting a lot of animal waste in one location. In the case of heavy rainstorms and so on, a lot of that waste can escape the system, even though they do work to contain it. If there's a flood, for example, or a heavy rainstorm, some of that waste gets carried away and runs off into local waterways. All right. Now, let's contrast that system with free range meat, which also has certain advantages and disadvantages. So, first of all, way fewer inputs of water, grain, and fossil fuels, right? The idea with uh, pasture-raised animals is they are actually just eating directly from the ground. In this case, grasses, as you're seeing in the background picture here. Now, that could be native grasses. So the amount of input going into this system is basically just having an area cleared that contain the cattle in, probably some fencing, all right, and then relying on nature to produce the food for the cattle as opposed to growing high input corn or other grains that is then grown and then fed to the cattle, right? So we have fewer inputs associated there. The animals are healthier because they're able to move around and are less confined, so the likelihood of disease spreading is smaller. All right. And it sort of mimics what happens in nature. So nature is full of these large grazing herds. So bison are the native grazers here in the US, right? But, similar to what happens in the savanna in Africa. So this process mimics kind of what happens in nature. All right. Now, if grazing is done properly, the cattle and the grass can actually develop a mutualistic relationship. Because as they eat the grass, as long as they're moved off before they cause overgrazing, right? Uh, their waste actually fertilizes the grass, and it can actually grow back denser and lusher as a result, but only if it's done properly. All right. Now, some disadvantages. We do have less food per acre. So you can grow basically a kilogram of beef requires fewer acres of land when done in the CAFO style versus a kilogram of beef raised on a pasture. All right. It is less profitable because it's less mechanized. Um, And if done improperly, it's sort of like the opposite of what happens if it's done properly. Uh, with grazing animals, there is the potential for overgrazing and desertification. All right. A lot of this is all over the world. It's kind of a fine balance there. You got to get the animals in to feed and move them early enough, right, so that they don't actually end up damaging that grassland. All right. Um, Now, antibiotic use for meat production. Again, this is a topic that we will delve into a little bit more in class, but CAFO style productions frequently use like a continued low level antibiotics, and it really serves two purposes. One is it helps to prevent the spread of infections because we have these closely quartered animals, right? That's a breeding ground for bacteria and really easy to spread. So by continuously feeding low-level antibiotics, it helps to prevent those infections from occurring in the first place and helps prevent the spread. All right. But it's also been proven that when animals are fed continuous low-level antibiotics, it actually increases their growth rate. So there's a profitability margin. So for every dollar invested in these low-level antibiotics, right, there's a good return on that investment in terms of the growth of the animal. All right. But as a result, the amount of resistant bacteria, right, or the percentage of bacteria that are resistant year after year has been increasing at an exponential rate, right, which is a big concern. And again, we will talk about that more in class. All right. Now, what about seafood? So, a very important protein source for about 16% of the human population, right? So, this is a high quality protein. All right. It's really important to certain cultures that live near the ocean. Okay. Now, fishing from the ocean, very different type of footprint than raising livestock on land. First of all, there is no land use issues, right? And very, very small in terms of inputs, right? Basically, you need a fishing vessel and nets, all right, is the way we go about getting seafood from the ocean. So much lower input, much smaller footprint associated with it. All right. But we do know, and we've read about this in previous units, the sort of the tragedy of the commons issue in our open oceans, right? Uh, so with lots and lots of people and with improved technology, we can actually overharvest or overfish the oceans, reducing biodiversity, all right, and causing harm to people that actually directly rely on seafood for a big part of their caloric intake and protein. Okay. Um, so one of the things that they've done to help kind of combat this idea of overfishing, to help the fish stocks and the populations improve, is this idea of aquaculture, which is basically farming our seafood. All right. Um, the idea is to try to make seafood production and relying on seafood more um, sustainable. So some advantages: we can get a really high yield of seafood, right? It's really efficient, and it helps reduce the overfishing that might occur in the open ocean. Uh, and it's sort of a niche market, so jobs, and it's a pretty profitable process. Disadvantages, um, we do get localized water pollution because, again, anytime you're putting a lot of animals in a confined space, we have a concentrated waste output, right? And it has a high potential to leak out into our waterways. All right. Um, they often use like estuaries and mangroves because they're sort of just ideal locations uh, for that. And so we do encroach on habitats a little bit, although not nearly as much as we do for things like beef. All right. We get a higher spread of disease just like you would in a CAFO operation and often lower genetic diversity. So there is some concern about the farmed fish, for example, escaping and spreading in the wild and impacting the genetic diversity in the wild populations. All right. So that takes us to the end. I beat 15 minutes this time for you guys. I'll see ya next time.